So let's work on that modal. For that, in the UI folder, I'll add a modal.js file, and attached, unsurprisingly, you find the styling file for this modal, the modal module CSS file. And then here we have that modal, which will receive props. And of course, we export this component like this. And then here we can also import classes from /modal.module.css and then work on the markup for this modal. And here I will have a special markup, kind of, because I want to use React Portal for both my backdrop, so that thing behind the modal overlay, which blocks interaction with the rest of the page, and I also want to render the modal overlay itself with React Portal to use that component wherever I want, but render the actual HTML elements in a specific place in the DOM tree. That is something you learned about earlier in the course, portals. And to render a portal, we first of all need to go to the public folder, and there the index.html file. And here we got this root div where the overall React application is being rendered. And above that root div, I will add another div with an ID of overlays. And that is the div where I want to portal my modal and the backdrop to. So that is a change we need to make to index.html. And with that back in the modal.js file, we can create the backdrop and the overlay and then use the portal. Now I will create two separate components for that, and since they are really closely tied to this modal component and both very lean, I will create them here in the same file, but if you go for separate files, that of course would also be fine. But I will add the backdrop component function here in this file, and then also the modal overlay component function. And both receive props because both will receive data. Now for the backdrop, we return a div with a class name of classes.backdrop using that backdrop CSS class, which is defined in the modal module CSS file. And for the overlay, I will return a div with a class name of classes.modal. And inside of that, I'll have another div with a class name of classes.content. I simply have these two divs for styling purposes. And then inside of that inner div, I'll output props children. So in the end, this will be the actual content passed between the modal opening and closing tags by the component where the modal is getting used. It won't work right now, but it will work in the future. So now we got these components. Now, here in the modal function, which is the main component which is being exported here, we now, of course, also need to return some markup. And there I want to have backdrop and overlay side by side. And for this, we'll need the fragment. So I'll import fragment from React and then simply return fragment. And in there now, backdrop and modal overlay. And this is how we could do it, or actually modal overlay like this to forward the content between the modal tags. But this is how we could do it if we would not be using a portal. Now, we technically don't have to use a portal, but to ensure that our HTML code is not all over the place in the final application, I will use portals here. And therefore, I will output two dynamic expressions here side by side, and I will call the createPortal method, which is built into React in both these expressions. For that, we need to import it, and it is actually imported, or it is available on the React DOM object from React-DOM. So not the React library itself, but the React DOM library, which of course also is by the React team though. And with this import added, therefore, we can access React DOM, create portal, and create a portal for the backdrop, and do the same down there. React DOM, create portal for the modal overlay. And here we need to pass props children between the opening and closing tags so that in the modal overlay that can be used. Now, create portal needs a second argument though. It does not just need to know what to portal, but also where to portal it. And therefore we should select this div here with the ID overlays in our index.html file. Now, since we will need that in both create portal calls, I will create a helper constant here, which I'll name portal element. Obviously, the name is up to you. And here we can access document get element by ID overlays to get access to that overlays div. And then it's this portal element, which I pass as a second argument to both create portal calls. And that's now the finished code for that modal, at least for now. And with that code, we can go back to the cart component and there replace that wrapping div with modal. Like this. Obviously for that we need to import the modal component first though. So import modal from going up one level UI modal, not from the CSS file though, but from the JS file. And then we can use modal as our opening and closing tag. And to see this in action now, we need to use that cart component somewhere. And I will use it in the app.js file. So here I will now import cart from /components cart and then the cart.js file like this. And then maybe above the header, the exact position doesn't matter too much since we use a modal with a portal anyways. But here I will then add cart. Not cart, but cart. Like this. And if we save this, we should have this cart modal here. Now, at the moment, it's always there, and we can't make it disappear. But that is something we're going to add next. Because, of course, it shouldn't always be there. It should be there when your cart button is clicked. And, of course, it should also be closable. And that is definitely also something you can try implementing on your own. But, of course, we're going to do it together in the next lecture. So how can we now ensure that the cart is only showing up when your cart button is clicked and can be removed if we click on the backdrop or the close button? Well, we need to manage some state because we have different states now. One state where the cart is visible and one state where it's not visible. These are two states. And whenever you have more than one state, you need to manage that state with React. And in function components, as we have it here, we use useState for that. So we import useState from React in the app.js file. Why in this file? Because that is where we do render the cart. So that is where I want to manage the visibility of the cart. Of course, we could also do it in some parent component and pass down the state data through props, but the only parent component to the app component is index, and that's not even a component, that's just where we initially render it, and therefore we actually have no parent component. And even if we would have, it makes a lot of sense to manage it here. So inside of the app function, I will use destructuring to pull out the two elements I get back from calling useState. My initial state is false because that is my cart is shown state, and we also have a setCartIsShown function. And here we are just using useState as you learned it throughout this course, registering it with React so that React can manage this state for us for this component, and then getting access to the latest state snapshot whenever this component is re-evaluated, and getting access to this function, which allows us to update the state. And then here we can add a couple of functions to that functions. Functions which should be called when this button is clicked, for example, or when the backdrop is clicked. Because I'm talking about a showCartHandler function, which is a function defined here inside of the app function. in which I then call setCardIsShown and set this to true. And then I'll also add a hideCardHandler function like this, where I set cardIsShown to false. And now we just need to use that cardIsShown state and make sure that these two functions, which I just added, are getting called. Now let's start with using the cardIsShown state. In the end, we want to render the card component conditionally. And you learned how that works. You can simply wrap this in curly braces to evaluate a dynamic expression, and then access cardIsShown and use that shortcut with double ampersand operator to render card if this is truthy and not render it if this is falsy. And with that, the card disappears because initially it's false. Now showCardHandler should be called whenever this button is clicked. This button, however, is part of my header. So therefore, we should probably expect to get that function, that showCardHandler function called from inside the header. And for the header, to call this function, we need to pass a pointer at the function down through props. That's also a pattern you learned about throughout this course. Now it's up to you how you name that prop, but the convention for these props which hold functions is to start with on, since these are kind of like custom events which trigger this function if you look at it like this. And therefore here I'll name it onShowCard. Again, name is up to you. And I point at the showCardHandler. Important, don't execute it here, just point at it so that it can be executed from inside the header through that onShowCard prop. So inside that header component, we now want to execute that function, and we want to execute it whenever this header card button is being clicked. Now, this of course is another custom component, and therefore here, let's say we expect that we have an onClick prop. Again, this is up to you. I'm just using this name, which looks like the built-in onClick, because I in the end want to react to the button being clicked. But technically, you can use any name you want here, because you will have to write code inside of header card button to handle this prop anyways. But to this prop, I want to pass a pointer to that function I'm receiving on props onShowCard here. So in the header component, we receive the onShowCard prop, which points at showCardHandler. And now I'm forwarding that pointer at that function to the onClick prop on the header card button. And now in the header card button, we therefore need to handle that onClick prop, which we receive. Here on that built-in button, there is a built-in onClick prop. So here the name is not up to you. And I now want to point at props onClick, so that the function I receive on onClick in the header card button is forwarded to the onClick prop on the button. This can be confusing, but in the end, we're just passing down a pointer at this showCardHandler button to that header card button. Now, you learned that if you have a prop chain like this, where you pass a prop through multiple levels of components, could be replaced with context. And indeed, we could use context here for handling this card visibility state. I will not do it here though, because I think here it is okay to have these two levels of components through which I'm passing props. But you could implement context here as well if you wanted to. We are going to use context in this demo application as well, but not for this card button. Here I will instead go for this prop drilling, so for this chain of props. With that, however, if you save everything, if you click your card, it should open up. Now to make it closable, we want to make sure that both that close button as well as a click on the backdrop closes the card. So therefore, in app.js, where we use the card component, we should probably expect a onClose prop or something like this. As always, the name is up to you, to which we pass the hide card handler. And now it's inside of that card component where we need to handle this onClose prop. For one, I want to go to that close button and there add a onClick prop and point at props.onClose. OnClose because that's the name I just chose in the app.js file. It's the onClose prop on which we receive the hide card handler, and therefore it's this function which I now want to forward to the button, so that upon a click on the button, that hide card handler function is being called. Now that's one way of closing the modal. It should also be closed if the backdrop is clicked. And to make that happen, we should go to the modal component, and on the backdrop there, we should add an onClick prop to the div. So using that built-in onClick prop, which exists on basically all HTML elements. And there, forward the value we expect to get on whatever prop you want. So here, let's say I expect to get an onClose prop. Now here, when we use the backdrop, we need to set that onClose prop because we just added it inside of the backdrop. And here I expect to get another onClose prop, but now on the modal component itself. So again, here I'll be passing a value through multiple levels down to the backdrop. You could use context, but I also want to highlight that if you are using context and you always bind a click on the backdrop to closing the card, then you would make this backdrop very specific and you would not be able to use the modal for other kinds of content because clicking the backdrop would always close the card. So if you had other content in modals as well, then you would be too specific. So here, using multiple levels of props could even be better because in this case, it makes the modal more reusable and doesn't tie it to one specific use case. That's just a side note why here I think using props instead of context is good, even though we are passing data, or to be precise, a function through multiple levels of components in this case. And therefore now, in the card component, on modal, we can add the onClose prop as well and forward props onClose. And that's now the onClose prop for the card component, which is being set in the app component. And that is then this hide card handler function. With that, we can open the card, click on the backdrop to close it, or click on the close button to close it. So that's working. And with that, we implemented the card, at least with some dummy data here. It's not finished at all at the moment though. As a next step, I want to make sure that we can really add card items, and then we'll also refine the card overall, and so on.